Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are, what time you are watching this or listening to this. My name is Winston, and this is the Revenue Alignment Podcast. I am your host, and today we have Ashley Faus with us. Ashley, how are you doing?
I'm good. How's it going?
I'm great as well. I believe, yeah, this is the second time you've actually done a podcast with me. The first one was when I had the conversation with marketers, and I know we brought you on to discuss more things marketing, but from a different topical standpoint this time.
Yeah. It's always good to chat.
Yeah, so I know your journey, Ashley, and I'm sure a lot of people on LinkedIn do as well. But before we even get to that, let me just share with them who you really are in terms of your credentials. So you've held several positions as marketing manager, several marketing manager positions, senior marketing manager, senior corporate communications manager, content strategist, content strategy lead. And today you are the director of integrated product marketing at Atlassian. And I would even say probably, well, at least for me, that is, one of the biggest marketing influencers, leaders on LinkedIn. I always enjoy your content.
Oh, thank you. It's fun. It's fun. I get to talk about a lot of different things. LinkedIn's a good place. I highly recommend it.
Yeah. All right. So why don't you share your journey with us, for those of us who, well, those who may not be familiar. I know I'm familiar, but for those of us who aren't familiar.
Sure. So I am Ashley. I'm a marketer, writer, and speaker by day, and a singer, actor, and fitness fiend by night. I do like to combine the personal and the professional. So if you follow me on LinkedIn, you might see cake in your feed. I've recently picked up baking. You might see, some fitness analogies in your feed. You'll definitely see some musical theater comments in your feed. I've worked across a number of different industries. I've been in Atlassian for almost 5 years now and worked across a number of different teams and topics and areas of marketing. So these days, I would call myself a marketing generalist, but I tend to specialize in content, social media, thought leadership, and kind of the intersection of all of those pieces.
Yeah, awesome. And by the way, you actually do a really great job with the cake making, because I've seen some of your pictures of cakes that you've made. I'm like, wow, actually has talent. If she ever decides
thank you.
transition away from marketing.
I've been practicing. I will say the cake baking is not an hourly rate that any of us want to work for. We definitely want to make money at our tech job and keep the cake as a hobby for sure.
Right. Which goes to my first question, really. You and I were talking about this the other night, but I definitely wanted for this conversation, where I mentioned that you seem to have a lot of autonomy at Atlassian, because you just mentioned you do your fitness stuff, you do your cake baking, but one of the things I've realized, especially in the last couple of months, is you have a lot of speaking engagements. Like you speak a lot, you create content on LinkedIn, I would say pretty much every day, even breaking down some of your frameworks, designs, and all of that, plus your full-time job. You recently got promoted, so that means more responsibility, probably a bigger team to manage. So what I really want to know is how do you manage to gain that level of autonomy as someone who's a marketing leader? Because let's be frank and honest, marketing almost doesn't really have that much autonomy in terms of certain things that they can and cannot do within the organization. And I'm sure you probably have your bosses seeing you do all this stuff and wondering, well, is Ashley actually getting our work done? So what's your secret behind that?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things. I was thinking about, actually, since we kind of started the conversation initially, and my gut reaction when you asked me that was to kind of laugh and say, well, part of it is that I'm not actually doing a lot of this on business hours. So I'm doing the slides on the weekend. I'm practicing the talk track in the evening. I write my LinkedIn posts at 7:30 in the morning. I do the majority of that work outside of business hours. So even if you see something happening during business hours, that 1 hour, that's the only hour that's happening during business hours, right? Like, this podcast is happening during business hours for me, but it's only an hour. All the rest of that prep work has been done outside. I spent the better part of the last 2 years, recording alone in my living room on a Saturday. And so I think that's the first thing, is that the bulk of the work is actually happening outside of business hours. The second thing I'll say is that Atlassian, from a values perspective, is highly aligned with the work-life balance. We have a value called build with heart and balance. That's one aspect of it. We do have another value called be the change that you seek. And so that is another way, again, I'm empowered to say, this is something I'm very passionate about. This is a topic that I think the world needs to hear about. I'm going to be the change that I seek, and I'm going to share about it. So from a values perspective, Atlassian is highly aligned to support that. I think that the third piece of this is that as a company, we understand that our employees being out in the world, talking, showing their passion, being smart, talking about the problems that we're solving, that's good for the brand. And so even if it's not, quote unquote, officially supported in the sense that I get design time and I get, ghostwriters and I get, whatever other support in terms of resources to do this, I am empowered to do this myself. And the company realizes that it benefits them. So my manager is not looking at it and being like, I noticed that you posted a comment at 11:58 on LinkedIn and therefore you weren't working. No, I get my stuff done. I show up for my meetings. I deliver my results. And how I do that, that's the part that's, we value outcomes over output, and we have good measurement in place for those outcomes. And so she doesn't have to look at what time I'm on LinkedIn or how late I'm staying up or staying online. Do I get my stuff done? Yes. Do I also do all of this other stuff on the side? Yes. So there's a little bit of that balance that comes from, from a company perspective in terms of that value. And then I think, sorry, I said two things, and now I think I'm up to like 4 or 5. So I'm like, this other thing. Why we don't name numbers when we get started with this. I think last thing I'll say, truly last thing, and then I'll pass it back to you, is I am more senior in my career. And so I do have more of that flexibility. I didn't have this level of autonomy early in my career. It's been a gradual building of trust, skills, processes, habits, understanding when I work best, how I work best, what is the right balance for me. And so I think I would say if somebody's fresh out of college and they're like, why does this person who's, 10, 15 years out of school has been doing this in their industry, why are they able to do this? And it's like, well, I have a lot more experience and I have a lot more autonomy. And so I know how to balance that because I've built that trust over a long period.
Yeah.
That was the last thing.
That was an awesome response. There are so many things I want to unpack from that. One of the main things I'm picking up here is that, I guess you could call it culture, coming from a leadership standpoint, how important it is to be in an organization, in an environment that gives you that freedom and flexibility to say, hey, as long as you're delivering what you're supposed to be delivering on, we're okay with you going out and doing all these different side projects, as long as it doesn't, conflict or interfere with work. Probably where I'll start is kind of help us to understand, how did you build up that trust? I call it marketing political capital, meaning how can you execute and do things in such a way that it gives you autonomy, it builds up that autonomy, that leeway, that leverage, where marketing kind of has that say in terms of how they work, how they execute, and leadership won't necessarily question it so much and get a lot of buy-in from them. How did you gradually build up that trust throughout your career?
Sure. I think one of the biggest things is the visibility, and that comes in 2 ways. One, having well-defined metrics where everybody agrees on what those metrics are, how they're being measured, how they're being gathered, where is that data coming from, and making sure that leadership and the people who are executing, whether that's at a strategy level or a kind of tactics level, that everybody's aligned all the way across. So that's one way, is making sure that you actually are in alignment about what is being measured and how it's being communicated. And then the second piece of that from a visibility standpoint is actually communicating it. So we have a number of practices, right? Like I see this all the time where people, we see this, we need a dashboard for this. We need a report for this. This report is weekly. Is anybody literally looking at that weekly report? Probably not. So if you're doing all of this work to report up and have visibility and nobody's looking at it, or you're not communicating in in a way that people actually can consume it, then you don't actually have that visibility. So one of the big things that I've seen as I've grown, a weekly report with all of this nitty-gritty detail, that sounds good in theory. No one is going to read that nonsense. So be honest about what's actually going to get consumed. What is the one, maybe two metrics that leadership actually cares about? How do they want to consume that? Do they want a weekly email wrap up? Do they want a Slack message? Is there a dashboard that they want a screenshot of? We actually have a product that's called Atlas. It's a new product for us, and it's great. It literally is 280 characters. That's all you get to do your updates. And they are weekly updates, and you can put a screenshot in there, but it's well defined about who reads those updates. And it's, in my case, it's my manager, my skip level manager, and potentially my 2 levels up from me. That's a very different audience than my peers or my direct reports. And so what goes into those updates helps build that trust, because it's the thing they actually care about that we've agreed on, and it's presented in a way that they can actually consume it. And so if people want to know, is Ashley delivering her work, or is she wasting time on LinkedIn? Well, go look at my Atlas tickets, and you can see there's a screenshot of all the numbers that we've all agreed on, and you can see that those numbers are trending up. Or if they're not trending up, you can see the action items that I'm taking to improve them. And so I think that visibility is key in terms of the alignment on what you're measuring, and then how to actually track those metrics in a way that leadership will actually consume.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because I'm a firm believer that every marketer that well, I guess every marketer would report directly to some level of C-suite or some level of leadership. But I think there definitely needs to be a case where there is like this internal newsletter that goes out every week, right? And the reason why I say that is because I've actually seen how this played out. For me, I was working with a client, and the marketing team, they're always complaining that they can't get buy-in for marketing, they can't get the budget that they need, like they literally have to be pulling teeth. So one of the things I did when I started working with that client is I would provide weekly updates to like the senior leadership team. So that was like the head of sales. They didn't have a head of marketing at the time. It was the CEO, the COO, and probably two or three other partners. And as a result of that, because they were seeing, as you said, those 1 or 2 key metrics that's of importance to them, and they saw over the weeks, like, give a report on this is what the metrics are for this week based on this specific execution that we did. This is what we're going to do next week and what we hope to achieve by executing on that. And as a result, at the end of that campaign, or me working with them, the marketing team was able to get buy-in for a 10x increase in their marketing budget. Just as a result of that, just a big, right, that communication, actually executing, delivering results that they care about, and actually communicating, as you say, on a consistent basis. Which let me. Well, this is the second thing I wanted to unpack based on everything that you just said. Where I remember you shared, I think it was a LinkedIn post, and I commented on it, and you shared this with me. In terms of you getting buy-in from the engineering team to actually, I wouldn't necessarily call it social selling. It was just more engaging with their peers, but still could actually get Atlassian brand out there, which to me was amazing, because I've worked with engineers, and engineers don't like to interact with anyone, whether a customer or anyone outside of the company that they need, so that they don't want to interact with anyone. Probably share with us how were you able, whether you personally or the Atlassian marketing team, to get that buy-in from engineers, because one of the big things is how can marketing get buy-in from non-marketing functions. So how were you able to achieve that?
Again, I think this goes back to that autonomy piece. A lot of the reason that employee advocacy or amplification or non-marketing sharing goes wrong is because the marketers try too hard to get the engineers or the product managers or whoever it is to share marketing things. And so I think one of the posts that I posted, it was kind of a rant. I was like, you know what? I think my new hot take, I think I'm against providing assets for people to share. Like, I think I'm done providing copy, because if you're a marketer or a PR person, somebody who does words, you want to use your own words. Like, I don't want somebody else to tell me what I'm supposed to say. Tell me what message you want me to communicate, and I'll say that in my own way.
Right.
If you're an engineer, product manager, UX designer, you don't want to sound like a marketing shill. And so in a lot of cases, what the marketers do is they come to the engineers or the PMs and they say, hello, we have crafted this copy. Please copy and paste it. And you'll need to share Monday, Wednesday, and Friday exactly what we've copied. And they're like, I will not be doing that, because now you're turning me into a walking advertisement. And I hate that. No. And then if you're in the C-suite, you're like, this is stupid. I don't want to do it at all. But actually now I have something important to say, so I'm going to just say it myself, right? So I think that empowerment and saying, if you want to achieve these outcomes, this is the output you have to do. It's not me as a marketer telling you this is what you need to say. And so I think there's sometimes it's a push, sometimes it's a pull, right? Sometimes, we'll hear the war for talent, right? This is true across all industries. We're seeing it in marketing, but especially in engineering. How do we attract top engineering talent? And people will say, man, we're really solving some really cool problems. If candidates only knew the cool work they could do. Yes, if candidates only knew. You know how they know? We share blog posts, or we share on LinkedIn, or we share on Reddit. And we'll hear things. People will be upset. They'll be like, I saw this posted on, this other blog. We're doing that, but way better. Why aren't we featured? Well, let me tell you how you can get featured. You have to write things, or you have to make videos, you have to actually put yourself out there. And so that's one way. Sometimes I think the issue is that they just don't know that this is a skill. I worked with one fellow. He's one of our senior security architects. Super smart guy. And I had reached out because I needed something for one of my programs. And his, he landed kind of in my inbox. It's like, oh, you should ask this guy. He'll know. And so I reached out and I said, hey, I'd love for you to write about this topic. And here's all the things I can offer to distribute it or whatever. And he was like, wait, you're telling me this is a thing? Like, this is
really?
This is like a thing I can do? And I was like, yes, and he had a page literally of 100 ideas, and he just didn't know how to get them out into the world. And then he reaches me, and I've got my thought leadership framework. I've got my content strategy framework. I've got narratives. I've got depth. And he's like, you're telling me this is a whole skill? Like, he just didn't know. And so I think some of it is there's an element of people get annoyed. They're like, how did this happen? Marketing can help you with that, or marketing comes with a request, a one-off request, and they start to realize, oh, wow, this is actually a whole thing we can do. So I think the biggest thing is that, just like with all of our marketing things, where we have to know our audience, we have to speak to them as whole humans, we have to give them something. You have to go. You can't just go with an ask and say, I as a marketer need this thing from you, and you must do it this way. No, our audience has this question. You are capable of answering that question, or, you have this need for hiring or for, showcasing your knowledge. And I happen to have the skills to create and distribute those ideas in a way that will resonate with that audience. So why don't we work together? It's not me coming to you and forcing you to write things for marketing. I think anytime you come in and say marketing needs, they get real twitchy about that, because they're like, oh, you're turning me into a corporate shill.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I one of the things I loved, and it's something that I've often said, obviously not everyone does it, but most marketers do it, where they tend to communicate based on how marketing perceives value. And I'm always saying, no, like, if you want to get buy-in from the CEO, figure out what the perceived value is to the CEO and then communicate in that way. In this case, engineering. If it's sales, communicate based on what sales thinks is important and what they value. And that's how you get by, not by going to them and say, hey, well, we needed to do this because it can help us to build brand awareness and, build community and, raise visibility, whatever the case is. Because in all honesty, they don't care about that. Like, we are the only ones as marketers who really care about that stuff. They don't care.
Yeah. I think the other thing too with building that credibility is to bring if I'm over here doing all of this stuff on my own, so I learn the hacks for the algorithm or whatever it is, bringing that back in. So the other thing that we'll see sometimes, not just in engineering, but as a whole for non-marketers, they are willing and able to communicate, but they don't know the platform. They're not very good at distribution. And so that's a piece where you can come in and say, hey, I noticed you started sharing on LinkedIn, but they'll share like a link post or they'll hit the share button. And so coming in and being able to say, hey, actually hitting the share button is pretty useless. Like it doesn't really help the person you're sharing and your post will tank. Here's a better way to do it. Create an original piece of content. And so usually those helpful tips, that starts to help you build that credibility where people will say, oh, I can ask, marketing seems to know if there's a good way to do this. They helped me once when I was already doing something. They actually helped me be more effective. And so now I'm going to go to them early in the process instead of marketing having to find out later that something was shared or done in maybe the way that is not most effective given the platform, whether that's Twitter, whether that's SEO, whether that's LinkedIn, whether that's a conference pitch, that giving that credibility to say, hey, I noticed you did this thing. Here's actually a more effective way to do it. And again, especially for engineers where they're like, optimization, like, the lightest lift for the biggest bang, right? Like we all get very excited about that.
Yeah, also. And moving into my next question, Atlassian is a pretty big company, huge team. You guys have several product and service offerings, which means there's a lot of competing budget in terms of deciding, well, what do we invest in and what don't we invest in? And not just from a marketing standpoint, but whether that's research and development, whether that's product innovation, whether that's some, business operational efficiency, whatever the case may be, there's a lot of competing priorities when it comes to budget. How can marketing, being that you are a part of that sort of ecosystem, huge team, several product offerings, actually make the business case for an increase in budget to make it seem to those who are in charge of approving that budget that it's worth investing in marketing versus something else?
I think it goes back to those metrics. If you come in with just marketing metrics and not how those marketing metrics flow through to bottom line revenue for, the CFO, the CEO, that they care about, that's not helpful. You have, to your point about you've got to speak in the language that they care about. So all of the metrics that we agree on, the way we do things at Atlassian, we work with OKRs, so objectives and key results. So at the company level, we have our top line OKRs. And then each functional level, so marketing, engineering, R&D, and all the way down, again, to your point, we're a pretty large company. So even within marketing, we've got the marketing OKRs, and then each of those product marketing, community and social media, brand, they have OKRs, and all of that ladders up. And so instead of me saying, okay, I want to rank for this keyword, or I want to build this many social media followers, on our brand handles, whatever it is, right. All of that has to tie into what is that top OKR. And so obviously for marketing, those OKRs are around new customers or growing, customer growth. So we're a SaaS business. So we do need people to keep renewing their subscriptions and those kinds of things. So there's the land new customers, which is growing by getting new people. And then there's customer growth through retention. And so those tend to be our big OKRs at the marketing standpoint. That obviously then ladders up into, overall revenue growth for the company. And again, there's ways to do that. So when I start to look at coming all the way down to, okay, what is my team going to deliver for these products in these ways? It has to keep laddering all the way up. And then once you do that, you say, okay, CMO, CRO, for me to achieve my OKRs that roll into your OKRs, that roll into the company OKRs, I need this amount of money. And here's how. And so sometimes we'll make comparisons. The work that my team does is primarily in organic social, organic traffic, newsletter signups, community engagement. Pretty much everything I focus on is unpaid. We do have a performance team that does paid, right? So one of the ways that I can say, when I ask you to invest in me, I'm probably asking for budget for freelance writers or potentially another headcount to do these things or design resources. Given the amount of, traffic that I drive or eyeballs or impressions, signups, here's what it would cost you to buy advertisements to do the same thing. And so when you, and of course, on the ad spend, there's a place for that. But when you're starting to say, okay, do we invest in paid or unpaid? Okay, when you invest in paid, you're doing your cost per click analysis, your cost per conversion analysis. How does that translate into the stuff that I'm doing? And so you can make more of an apples to apples comparison to say it would cost you however many hundreds of thousands or millions or, whatever dollars to deliver these same results. If you invested over here, here's what you get. If you invested over here, here's what you get. It's not a competition, right? We need paid and unpaid, but that at least helps start to put it into that apples to apples comparison. And same thing on sales or channel, right? To say, if we invest in this incentive program from a channel partner perspective, we can expect to see this growth. We don't really compete is the wrong word, man. I think this might be a whole nother podcast. Can we talk about how why is budget this adversarial thing? I get it that there's only so much money and you got to split it up. But this idea that we're in competition with our own other orgs, I don't like it. The better way to do it is to say, how do we balance this, so that it's not lopsided, so that we deliver the best outcome for the customer, the best outcome for the company. In theory, that should help us balance the budget. But we, the CFO and the CRO and, the CTO, all of the C-suite tends to make the initial discussion, allocations between the big departments. And then it's like, okay, in marketing, do we want to invest in these products because the market is growing faster there? Do we want to invest in these strategies and tactics because they've proven to have a higher ROI? That's where you start getting into those discussions. So from my perspective, we're not really competing with R&D, for example, to say marketing versus R&D. We're not really, at least not at my level. I'm not seeing those discussions.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think one of the ways to actually approach this is, let's say, for example, we're talking about brand, we're talking about organic execution, whether that's social, whether that's community, whatever the case is. How I love to think about it or approach it, because brand is one of those things. It's very vague and abstract, and anyone outside of marketing doesn't really understand it or understands how it actually translate to business value. I always say, look at financial metrics, right? But not necessarily from the standpoint of, well, it's going to generate X amount of leads or whatever the case may be. It may be a case where, let's look on the market cap of the company. The company has IPO. Let's look on how it can help us to increase earnings per share. Let's look on how it will help the sales team to actually sell better, sell more efficiently, and that way it reduces costs for the company. So we're actually helping you save costs by investing more in brand. So that's how I always like to look at it.
I think the other piece is to realize that there's, especially for larger companies, there's so many more ways to get value than just a short-term sale. So for us, that could be strategic partnerships, that could be attracting more and better quality candidates for open roles across the company. That could be getting invited to bigger and better stages where more of our audience is sitting. And that, again, that audience doesn't just mean for sales today. That could be for sales tomorrow. That could be for partnerships tomorrow. That could be for candidates tomorrow. But, the difference between getting into this press outlet or getting mentioned by this analyst or getting included in this conference, that has a lot of value. And you start to see that. I mean, if you talk to our comms team, for example, and you see as we've grown and we have more brand recognition, the types of interview requests that we get are very different than they were 10 years ago. You see, again, startups as well, they cheer anytime they get any press mentions because they're tiny. And so it's hard for them. The, Googles and Atlassians and LinkedIn's and Apples of the world, are not hurting for requests the same way that a startup is. Well, why do you think that happens? Well, it's because of that branding and that growth. And again, just because we're a bigger company doesn't mean that every outlet cares about every single feature that we release, right? We're not not at that level, but we can tell those bigger stories because we've built that brand trust, both from a product experience standpoint, from a revenue growth standpoint, and then now really starting to get into that brand recognition standpoint. You see those effects longer term that turn into tangible effects. When you look back and you see, okay, how did we get to this point? You start to see how all of that adds up to a place where you have more access to customers, to candidates, to partners, to stages than you had 5, 6, in our case, 20 years ago, when we were just a tiny little startup by 2 college kids.
Yeah, the one about candidates is actually a good one in terms of attracting that really top tier talent, because it reminds me of an experience I had while working at a B2B tech startup where, I was the only one doing marketing and sales. But we decided that we wanted to bring on someone to kind of handle the content side in terms of writing. And I remember going through the interview process and sitting on one of the candidates. And she said that while she was researching, like initially she had heard about the company, but she didn't really pay attention to it. She didn't know what the company did. But once we actually started to focus on building brand through that content strategy, then she could immediately make the connection to say, oh, well, this is what these guys do. And it was because of that brand recognition that you just mentioned, really the reason why she decided to apply for the position, which back then it really blew my mind. But I think today it's something that even in the B2B space, like companies really need to think about, because brand isn't really that much of an important or perceived value when it comes to B2B.
Yeah. Well, and bring it back to your first question of how did I get the leeway and the autonomy to do all of these side projects? I do talk about Atlassian some on my profile. I tend to put it more through my personal experience versus just saying like, we're hiring. It's like, no, let me tell you about this great experience that I had on my team or with leadership or whatever it is. Other people come into the comments, and even on posts where I don't specifically say Atlassian, people come into my comments and be like, man, sounds like Atlassian's got a really healthy culture. Man, sounds like you got some great teammates at Atlassian. I'm like, I didn't say that this happened at Atlassian, right? But people see that it says Atlassian in my profile. And so, me being out there, I had somebody DM me the other day and said, hey, I just applied to Atlassian because I love your content. I had no idea what post, because I was looking through, I was like, did I recently post something about Atlassian? I don't know what post made her decide that she, wanted to apply to Atlassian, but she DM'd me and said, your content made me apply. Great. That's something that I can then take back as we're talking about how do we, expand and how do we think about hiring and say, hey, it's good for the company for your employees to be out there talking, whether we say Atlassian or not. And in my case, I do. Often enough that people feel like they make that connection. But it's a huge piece of it to have people out there saying smart things and then other people recognizing, man, every time I encounter somebody from Atlassian, they seem to be real smart. Yeah. I bet Atlassian's a good company that hires smart people, right? So there's that symbiotic relationship where if all I do is sit in my own little corner internally, then I'm stuck over here away from the rest of the business, and I'm stuck over here away from the rest of the industry. And it's like, no, as marketers, we should be on the front lines, both internally with the other teams and externally from an industry standpoint as kind of the face of the company, whether we're walking around with a big logo branded on our shirts or not. That's, it's, again, we don't have to be walking advertisements, but we can be representatives of the message, the problems, the customers, those kinds of things.
Yeah. And I definitely attest to, in terms of seeing your posts and thinking that, wow, Atlassian seems like a really great company to work at. So I definitely agree with that one. That's something that I've experienced following your content on LinkedIn. Going into, because you mentioned it earlier, and I'm glad you kind of brought it back full circle, where we talk about leeway, we talk about putting that content out there, not necessarily staying in your cubicle. And I saw posts you made. Well, I've been seeing posts where you talk about the 4 pillars of thought leadership. It's not like it's just one post. And I remember you actually decided to write an article about it to go more in depth. And I remember seeing that post. I bookmarked it, and I think it was probably a week or two ago. It came to mind that, oh right, I have that article by Ashley bookmarked. I need to go and read it. And I read through it, and I was completely blown away in terms of the how specific and how actionable the information was, how insightful it was. And one of my first thoughts is, well, we'll talk about thought leadership in terms of building your personal brand. If you're a business startup CEO, getting customers, getting speaking engagements, whatever the case is. But talk to us about those 4 pillars and how it would apply for a marketer internally to build their credibility and also to increase the perceived value of marketing within the organization. So first of all, what are the 4 pillars, and then how it actually helps marketing increase their credibility internally?
Yep. So the first pillar is credibility. This is, do people actually trust what you say? Do they believe that you are credible when you share ideas or whenever you share information? The second pillar is profile. So do people know you? How many people know you? What is the nature of those connections? The third pillar is being prolific. So how often are you sharing? How many different channels are you in? What types of assets are you sharing? And then fourth is depth of ideas. So I think that all of those do work together internally and externally. And I think particularly at a larger company, that profile piece and that prolific piece are actually really important. You can have credibility within your own internal team, but especially if you're in a larger company, it's hard for people to know you. So Atlassian actually has a really strong blogging culture, internal blogging culture. So people will frequently ask, like, oh, you need to write a blog post about this, or oh, you need to put out a blog post about this. And so being prolific and telling people who you are, most of my blog posts, I start with like, hi, I'm Ashley and I'm a marketer. Here's why you care about this. Here's why I'm qualified to talk about this, because people don't know me. Well, now they do. So I've started to build that internal brand the exact same way I'm building that external brand. I think about, oh, I should make a video about this and share it. Oh, I should write a blog post about this and share it. Oh, we have a Slack channel. Here's the channels that I need to share this blog post that I wrote in, right? It's the same content creation and distribution mentality. The depth of ideas piece is interesting. A lot of people focus on, here's the exact steps I took, but that's all they say. They're like, step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. But they don't think about, how do I say that in a way that somebody else could do it? Not just here's what I did, but how does this apply to you? And so when I think about, here's how we created this series or this process, or here's why we distributed it this way, instead of just sharing the results of that, I think about, if you're in this other team or you're in this other part of the organization, here's how this might apply to you. And so I have to still have that marketing mindset about how I do this internally. And it's fascinating, right? I have a reputation internally, and some of this people have told me, some of this I just see how things end up in my Slack mentions, that I know about a lot of different things, that I've done a lot of different types of marketing. And so if you have a question, I'm probably a good person to start with, because I probably have an opinion on it, right? Like I've probably done something with that. And so the number of people that come to me and say like, hey, your name came up about this thing. Can you tell me about this? Or can you give me some opinions? Or do you have any pages? Somebody said you know about this. And sometimes the requests I get, I'm like, why do people think I know about this? And I'll ask them, I'm like, how did you end up with me? Right. And it's fascinating, the 6 degrees of separation, that, oh, you worked with this person 2 years ago. And so I saw your comment on their page. And then I saw somebody else that I mentioned, like, yeah, do we know who this Ashley girl is? And then they're like, oh, yeah. she helped me with this other thing over here. And they're like, oh, that's interesting. I know about that. Right. And so by the time you make all these connections, it's because I'm commenting or I've written a page or I make those efforts to do that internal networking. And I'll pop in sometimes and be like, hello, hi, me. I'm just being nosy, but I have thoughts on this, right? And so that willingness to put yourself out there, the same thing online, the same thing externally, be helpful, answer questions. If somebody reaches out and says, hey, I heard you know about this. Can I grab some time with you? Say yes, be willing to have those conversations. And again, like I say, sometimes how those connections come, and maybe I'm not the right person to talk about it, or I'm not the most qualified, but because I've been here for almost 5 years now, I also know a lot of people and I understand how the organization works. And so I can introduce you to someone, and I'm free with that. I'll say, you know what? I'm not the best person. Let me introduce you to Winston, or, hey, have you talked to Winston about this? He seems like the better person to answer this question. And then I immediately send you a note and say, hey, Winston, this other person is going to come talk to you about this question, right? And now you think, oh, okay, in the future, Ashley will send people to me. I can send people to her. And so we start to make those connections.
Yeah, awesome. And quick note, guys, like I've actually reached out to Ashley several times and she's helped me every single time. So I definitely appreciate her for that. Do you find that there's much of a difference with building credibility? I mean, I'm almost sure you implied it, but I wanted to ask to get a definitive response on this. Do you think there's a difference building credibility in a smaller organization, like, startup, small business versus like a mid-market enterprise level company? And if so, in what way?
I do think there's a difference. I think that it's easier to build credibility in a smaller organization because people literally know you, they see the work, it's a lot more visible. It's easier in that way. I think in a bigger company, my understanding is, especially in tech, a lot of companies have that blogging culture or video culture or sharing culture, such that you can basically apply kind of those external principles about sharing to the internal. So startups are easier because everybody kind of knows each other. It's smaller, there's only one Slack channel that you got to go into and share. I think in bigger companies, though, there is a lot more of a culture of write a blog, make a video, send the weekly newsletter, those kinds of things. So I think I would say it's probably easier in a smaller organization, but I think that in a bigger organization, there's probably more of a culture of doing that, because most startups that I've been in are so focused on just get things done.
Yeah.
That this whole sense of like, share your knowledge, build your personal brand internally. It's like, I don't need to do that. I am the marketer. Like, if you need the marketing, you go to the marketer, which is literally just me. So, especially pre-COVID, right? We all said, the marketing team sit over there, go to them. Versus at a bigger company, you've got to kind of build that and share that. But there's a lot more mechanisms, kind of formal ways for you to do that. So I think it is easier in a smaller company, but it's hard in different ways.
Yeah, that's a good point. And just final question. Do you think that there's any specific skill that you can think about that marketing leaders are lacking that actually hinders them from getting a seat at that C-suite leadership table to, help determine strategic vision or direction of the overall company? What's that one skill?
I think the one skill, and it's a skill that they have, but they don't use very often. And that skill is stepping into the shoes of their fellow leaders. We do it for our customers. We're really good about being like, who's our ideal customer profile? What's their persona? What do they care about? Like, we got to be marketers for those people. But somehow when we come into our organizations, and particularly leadership, and I'm guilty of this too, right? I come in and I've gotten this feedback from my manager, and she's correct. I come in with all of my marketing metrics, right? And my marketing acronyms, and they're like, no, they literally don't know what that is. They don't know what that metric is. Like, they don't know the difference between organic traffic and paid traffic. And I'm like, I mean, it's literally in the definition. One, you pay money, the other you don't. And she's like, yeah, but they don't know that because they don't do it, right? So that take those marketing skills and apply them to your audience, where you literally have to spell out, they don't know what ICP is. They don't know what a flywheel is. They don't know what the difference between lead gen and demand capture and lead capture and inbound and SQL. They don't know any of that crap. They don't know and they don't care. Like, what does this mean for me when we talk about, when we translate these requests into features and we talk about customer satisfaction? What does that mean in terms of feature adoption? Here's those metrics. Okay, product leader, here's the metrics about feature adoption. And the reason that we see that worked is because marketing launched this feature, communicated about this feature, right? Like, no one cares about your email open rates. They care about how many people actually went into the product and clicked around on the features. So having to build those bridges, I think that's the skill. It's not that they lack the skill, it's that they forget to flex that skill. And again, I'm guilty of it too, right? Where I spend a lot of time, especially at my level, talking to other marketers. I don't spend as much time talking to the other leaders, in the organization. And I'm just starting to get to that point where I am becoming the voice of marketing to those leaders for my projects. It's not my manager. It's not my skip level manager championing the work that we do. I'm the person who's supposed to do that. And so it's been a very interesting mindset shift for me to realize, like, okay, I'm not just the voice of my work and my team to a marketer. I am now the voice of marketing to product or engineering or, C-suite or whoever it is. I have to show up as the marketer in that situation. And so it's very different. Like I have a number of mentors that they'll look at my work and tell me, like, this is great as a marketer. You're a good marketing practitioner talking to other marketing practitioners. You're struggling to be a marketing leader talking to other, business leaders, right? So I'm going through that shift myself. Again, I don't say that as a criticism of others. I say that as like, oh, I look in the mirror and see myself in this struggle.
Yeah, awesome. That's an awesome response. You have a lot of great responses for these questions.
Oh, thank you.
All right. So any before we close this out, any final thoughts? Probably something we didn't mention, a question we didn't ask that, relates to the whole idea of helping marketers get buy-in and prove their value at a C-suite level that you want to leave us with?
I don't think so. I think final takeaway is make sure you are showing up, be visible, raise your hand, show up. Nobody's going to come knocking on your door. So market yourself, market your work internally the same way that you think about marketing your products and services externally.
Awesome. And with that said, ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of Revenue Alignment Podcast. Ashley, thank you so much for coming on and bringing some incredible insights for us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This has been the Revenue Alignment Podcast. Join us next week where we have more amazing content to help you demonstrate, communicate, and prove your value at the C-suite level. I'm Winston, your host, and this is a wrap.